Okay, it's all yours, Sunil.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And hello, everybody. Nice to meet you all. So this is my first slide. Repurposing medicines. I'm going to talk about what it is and maybe a little bit about what it isn't, perhaps in the question and answer session at the end. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, who I am, and then developing medicines purposely, then a little bit about why we repurpose, and then I'm going to give a couple of examples of repurposing drugs in non-Parkinson's areas, and a couple of examples of repurposing in Parkinson's, and then a question and answer session. And I'm going to stop at slide 6 to take any questions, and you'll see probably why later on. So I'm Sunil Soni. I'm the new Clinical Development and Regulatory Affairs Manager at Parkinson's UK. I started in August in lockdown, and I was just saying to Ruth that I've not seen anybody actually physically at the office. Everything was done virtually, including all the interviewing, etc. And I do joke with them that they're all just holograms, and I'm just the only 3D person, but there we are. I mentioned there Jill Gallagher, who I'm replacing. You may or may not know her, but she retired in March of this year. So as Ruth mentioned, all my experience has been to date with pharma companies, 30 years or so. And that last, the second bullet is incorrect. There were 3 large US companies that I worked with and a very small startup, which actually after 5 years folded. And that's the way that little biotechs go. Last 8 years, I've been consulting with a Swiss company, Roche Genentech, and those are some of the areas that I was working in. And my interest at Roche began with, in Parkinson's, began with the use of digital tools and developing digital tools to try and help accelerate drug development in both Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. So some of the neurodegenerative conditions that we face. So developing medicines purposely. This really describes quite simplistically how new drugs are developed and get to patients. It all starts with identifying an unmet medical need. And this wasn't always the case, that this was a starting point. Usually, sometimes, many years ago, it was the commercial interest that took hold first. But now it's really to identify an unmet medical need. A lot of work goes into researching how to tackle a condition without even touching a patient. Many experiments are done both in the lab or in animals to show that the idea that you have is correct and that the drug candidate is safe to give to people. So once you've collected all of that information and a lot of clinical evidence that it works, it's reviewed by health agencies and they give an approval to the drug. All of that can take 10 years or so, and at a cost of about £1 billion for each drug. But that's not the end, it's only the end, another beginning. And then the drug has to be priced, and then you can sell it, and then eventually the patient gets some benefit. So what is repurposing and why do it? Well, simply, it's adapting a drug to use in a different purpose. Diseases from the outside may look different, but may share many of the same features on the inside. So this means that a drug originally developed to treat one condition may also be effective in other conditions because they impact the same underlying biological processes in the body. And I'll give you an example of these in Parkinson's later. So why repurpose? Well, if you lay out the path of a drug development, it looks a little like this. At the bottom, you'll see the scale, which is time. And here it says 12.5 years being the industry average, but this is an older slide and it's more like 10 years today. And each new drug has to go through this development path, and there are no shortcuts. But for a drug which is being repurposed, you may not need to go all the way back into the early stages of research, because a lot is already known about that drug because it's been on the market, it's been in patients for many, many years. And all of that information, which you know now about the drug, has all been reviewed by the agencies when they first gave approval. So it could be that a drug which is being adapted for new use in Parkinson's, a repurposed use, you might start at the red line, which is here, you can see here. And if that's the case, then you've obviously saved a lot of time and a lot of cost. And what that means is that to get to the market, you can get to the market much sooner with that repurposed drug, within 2 or 3 years, rather than the 10 years that you have to wait for a new drug. So let me just stop there for a minute, and then I'll ask if there are any questions, and then I'll carry on to give you some examples, both in Parkinson's of repurposed drugs and non-Parkinson's conditions, if that's okay.
If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Sunil a question. We'll just have a couple of seconds there. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
May I ask a question, please? Janet here. With the speeding up of the development processes with the COVID pandemic and the medication for that and the vaccines, do you think this will impact the development of other drugs and speed them up, and since it's shown just what can be achieved in a very short space of time?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and a very topical question. And I have an example of how the sort of international collaboration that the pandemic has fostered has really helped bring some treatments to bear on COVID itself. I think the hope is generally, amongst all the stakeholders, being the patient, the agencies, and the companies themselves, that some form of collaborative spirit that we've seen will prevail, and we will build on that. I think time will tell whether that's the case or not, but I think certainly that's the ambition and that's the hope of everyone, that we've seen a significant degree of collaboration. Maybe we can hold on to that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And especially it'd be good if in things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis, that would be really good if we could. Absolutely.
And there are organizations which are trying to help the companies accelerate drug development, and this charity, Parkinson's UK, is actually working with that consortium in the US. And maybe we could talk about that later on in the Q&A if you're interested. Okay, shall I carry on if there are no more questions? Or?
I think David has got. Is your hand up, David Jones, to ask a question? You're on mute, David. We can't hear you. If you could unmute yourself, that would be helpful, please.
What do the drug companies think about this?
About?
Repurposing their drugs.
Are
they happy? Are they likely to lose a lot of money? Do they cooperate?
Do they cooperate? Well, let me go to the end, and you'll see. Well, you may get an answer in 6 slides or so. And that's a really good question. And I didn't touch on it as deeply as perhaps the answer will require, but we will touch on it absolutely. Should I carry on then?
Yes, unless there's any more questions. I don't think there are for the time being. So yes, please carry on, Sunil.
Okay, lovely. Oops. Okay, so this is an example of repurposing, which is very topical, and it's in non-Parkinson's area. You may have heard of the drug Dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is a steroid, and it's been available for at least 50 years or so. It's used in a variety of conditions, from rheumatic problems to asthma to lung conditions and eye surgery. And actually, many years ago, back in the late 80s, I was involved with the eye surgery program. So this is a drug that I know quite well. For a number of good reasons, it was thought that because of its mechanism of action, it could help with some of the problems patients face with COVID. So these are really sick people on mechanical ventilators and in the ICU. And what's been found in a study which was really very quickly accelerated and performed very quickly, is that fewer people, about a third of people who were hospitalized and in need of extra oxygen, die when treated with dexamethasone. So that's a really good result of a repurposed drug. It prevents 30% of mortality. And it's a very precise effect, and that was also determined in this clinical study. It has no effects on mortality in those patients who were hospitalized but didn't require extra oxygen. So it's a very, very precise effect. And that's sometimes you find with clinical studies, is that the effect is very, very specific in a certain population of patients. So here I'm showing two studies which are repurposing old and not so old drugs for people with Parkinson's. Both of these studies are being supported by the charity today, and both are looking at different aspects of concerns which have been expressed by people with Parkinson's about some neurological issues. And these are psychosis, hallucination, delusion. But these are seen most often in advanced Parkinson's, so quite late in the journey. So the first study, Top Hat, is looking at a drug called ondansetron, which is a drug used in treating nausea caused by cancer treatments. And the second study, CAN-PDB, is looking at cannabidiol, which is a medical form of cannabis, which is used medically to treat some forms of severe epilepsy. And it's thought that the particular ways in which both of these drugs work may also help in reducing the neurological symptoms in people with Parkinson's, namely hallucinations and psychosis. And because so much is known about these two drugs, because they've been on the market now for at least 20 years in some form or another, a lot of information is now known that wasn't known then when they were first developed and put on the market. And so what this means is that we can start these studies without having to go back very early in the research path in early research. And both of these studies will now be recruiting Parkinson's patients within the next month or so. So these repurposed drugs could come onto the marketplace for use in these particular conditions to treat hallucinations and psychosis within 2 or 3 years, which is much faster than the 10-year program that would have needed if these were very new drugs. So this next example is a little bit more complicated because much less is known about how this drug in diabetes might work in Parkinson's, but I'll try and simplify the idea as much as I can. So the first piece of evidence which led to this new research is that people with diabetes also have a slightly higher risk of developing Parkinson's. The second piece of information is that insulin, which manages the level of sugar in the blood, also helps protect brain cells from stress. And both of these conditions, diabetes on the one hand and Parkinson's on the other, are both linked to problems in the way cells handle sugar to provide energy. And there are these GLP receptors which help cells manage insulin and energy use. And these are found both in the gut and in the brain. In the gut, and that would explain the effect it has in diabetes, because these receptors occur in the gut. The drug, as I said, which is used to manage diabetes, acts on these GLP receptors, and so it could help manage the energy use in the brain because these receptors are also found in the brain. But that's the question that needs to be answered in clinical studies. Oops. Now, but to answer this particular question, more work had to be done to test the theory. And so the development of this repurposed drug from diabetes to Parkinson's began much earlier, as I've shown in the red line here. So a lot of this work had to be done in order to get to where we are now, which is that clinical studies today have just started using this drug in diabetes to be repurposed for use in Parkinson's. So the more that is known about a drug, the quicker it'll come onto the marketplace if it's been repurposed for use in Parkinson's or any other treatment. So my last slide is this, and I hope this will answer some of the questions about what the companies feel about this. So usually repurposing is of drugs about which much is known, and so are usually older drugs which have come off patent. And so what that means is that if there's no patent, then anyone can experiment with that drug, and then with new experimentation come new discoveries, and then with new discoveries can lead to new repurposing opportunities. as I've just shown you in the last few slides. And I was looking at this recent paper, and there are some 50 trials ongoing which are using repurposed drugs to bring new treatments in Parkinson's. So that's quite a bucket full, if you like, of drugs that might be coming down the line for Parkinson's. The question about what companies think is because these are usually off patent, they no longer have an interest in the drug. It's just making whatever it's making on the marketplace. But because of the fact that there's no patent, they're loath to themselves find new uses for their old drugs, because there's not necessarily a commercial incentive to do that. And that's why it's down to perhaps charities like UK Parkinsons with Ondansetron and with cannabidiol to try and fund those studies, which may not otherwise get funded by large pharma companies. And that's the reason why repurposing is usually done by smaller groups, charities, and other organizations, not necessarily large pharma players. So that's actually the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions that anybody has.
Ruth, I think you're on mute still.
So Sunil, if the formula for the new drug or the old drug is changed, would that change the patent and make it more commercially interesting for the farmers?
Yeah, just changing the formulation may not in itself give enough patent coverage.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So it needs to be a significant change. I mean, sometimes you can do the study, a new clinical study, and give you some degree of protection from copycats. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to prevent copycats following your research, and they get a share of the commercial value. It's largely the reason why large pharma companies don't repurpose, because there's no value in it.
Yeah. And thank you. That answers my question.
I think Julie and Andy have got a question. You're on mute at the moment, Julie and Andy. If you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. How do you identify drugs that? What kind of research do you have to do to get them on the list for repurposing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that explains why repurposed drugs come far and few onto the market, because trying to identify a different use, you have to go back to the original biology. Now, with the two drugs in the charity is supporting, in CAN-PDP, which is ondansetron and cannabidiol, because they've been on use in patients for many, many years, there was anecdotal evidence that some of these drugs had effects on psychosis in those patients who were being treated for nausea, the cancer patients who've been treated for nausea. And so there was some evidence, clinical evidence, that this might work in psychosis, not just in Parkinson's, but psychosis in any patient group, right? So you could repurpose this drug for use in Parkinson's patients, but you would also have to have a parallel track to study it in other conditions as well, in other psychoses, in other groups of patients. It's a very complicated area to try and discover new uses for these old drugs. And now they're actually using artificial intelligence. You feed in a lot of biological data, and then the AI algorithm programs then churn out what might be useful conditions. And that's, I think, how they found Dexamethasone as a possible treatment for COVID by using these artificial intelligence.
Do you get feedback from neurologists, because they'd be the best source for information about repurposing drugs, surely? Yes.
There is a consortium in the US which we're working which has academics, researchers, neurologists, people who are interested in bringing new treatments or repurposing drugs for Parkinson's. And they help to identify those 50 candidates I was talking about, which are being currently studied. So and they're doing it. They're doing the same sort of analysis for other conditions as well, multiple sclerosis, for other neurodegenerative conditions. So not just Parkinson's, but others as well.
One final question: if it's still on patent, then you can't do much with it, by the sound of it.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Unless the company gives you permission to do that, and some will do that. They see the general good to society to do that. But by and large, if it's on patent still, it means that there isn't enough maybe evidence in the sort of clinical realm to say this might be a candidate for something else.
Yeah.
And then if it's on patent, you may not have the early research data because that's held by the company. So there are some problems there.
So it can take as long, but for a different reason, because they have to find like a Venn diagram, the bit that in the middle that matches up with the drug, you know, if it's for a different thing.
Yeah.
So the more scientific knowledge there is about how the brain works, hopefully the more of the drugs they'll be able to say, well, if that works for that, that will work for that.
Yes. Yes.
Is that right?
And,
yeah.
Yes, and this is why they're using AI, because AI can manage so much more data than individual scientists can, for example. So AI is like having a whole team of scientists working on the same problem at the same time, but working at an ultra fast speed.
Yeah.
So the use of, as AI develops, new candidates will be identified much earlier, I think, and more of them. So there is some hope there.
Is that how they discovered the dexamethasone was useful in COVID?
I'm not entirely sure there was AI, but I think that the best substitute there was just a lot of people with their brain power thinking through what might help, and dexamethasone came up as a likely candidate. But it was one of many different candidates, and a lot of them were tried in the same study. So whatever fell out, they replaced it with another one. If that fell out, they replaced it with another one. So that you can accelerate the studies that way. But this was a supranational, international effort to do this, the likes of which we haven't seen before.
I'm just thinking the Xenotide studies seem to be going on and on and on, and nearly taking as long as if they'd started from scratch.
Yeah, that's the example I was showing you. We had the diabetes and the Parkinson's, and then the little bit in the middle, which might be of common to both of the conditions. And I mentioned that because not as much is known about that drug and how it might work in Parkinson's, they had to go back very early on to do more research to see whether it would. And that's why it perhaps is taking longer than the two drugs that we're looking at the charity. So the more you know about it, the faster you can then bring it to the marketplace, because you've got to go back, you don't have to repeat as much and create new information.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, pleasure.
I think Matadon was one of the success stories of repurposing, wasn't it? Matadon was used for shingles originally.
Okay, I don't know about that one. Sorry.
Yeah, it gives you hallucinations though.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the hallucinations you get in advanced Parkinson's are sometimes to do with the treatments that you're getting at that time. It's you know, an overdosing effect, and sometimes you can resolve it by just lowering the dose, etc. But in those patients where lowering the dose of these existing treatments doesn't help, then these new repurposed drugs.
How will it work? Well, I mean, as far as I know, research scientists are very jealous of their little bit of knowledge that they have, and they're not always willing to share stuff. Is that gonna get better with after COVID? I
think if you talk about academics, they hold on to the results up until they publish, and it all becomes available. I think they're very they hold it close to the chest up until, and then they do publish, and then it becomes better. But data sharing, I think, is the future. Each, it all sits in little buckets which are separated from each other. If you combine it all together, and the charity is working with this consortium in the US, which is trying to pull all these data together from all the various companies who are researching new molecules in Parkinson's, to try and accelerate the effort to identify newer and better candidates. So there is a huge effort going on at the moment.
So does that mean the academics and the farmers are going to work together a bit more now?
Oh, they do. They work very, very close together. And in fact, what's happening now is that whereas you had research and development in a pharma, so you through research efforts you identify candidates, and then you take it into the clinical side, into the development side. What pharma companies now do is, rather than having research in their own facilities, they pay academic researchers to do that, and that actually that is much more productive, because you've got the best minds who are now paid to do just that little bit of research, and so that model is actually in favor now, and it does seem to be working quite well.
Well, that's good.
Can I ask a question, please? So, you mentioned earlier about there was a drug that has been used for epilepsy, which we're now looking at as a possible for Parkinson's. There are other drugs that were originally used for epilepsy, like gabapentin and that, which have been used for other neurological conditions since then.
Yes.
They've already been repurposed, I think.
Yes.
Would they be similar? Would they be helpful for Parkinson's, do you think, as well?
I don't know the answer to that, but I imagine that it's either been looked at or it will be looked at.
Right.
So if there's a possibility, then somebody will do it. Yes.
Yeah, because there are connections, are there, with epilepsy and Parkinson's, about the sort of parts of the body that work in the same way or are affected?
Not necessarily like that. The conditions match each other, but the way some of the underlying might be similar, and it's to affect that underlying biology that these drugs can be repurposed. Not all conditions have the same underlying biology. And that sometimes the trick is to find that underlying biology and see how similar it is, and whether you can bring those similar drugs to be repurposed from one treatment to or one condition to another condition.
Thank you.
Ask a question. Margaret, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Me? Can I ask something?
Yes, did you want to ask?
Carry on.
I was going to say, back in 2007, my late husband was told by his consultant that he was a curious and interesting case, because he had some form of dementia, and he also then developed Parkinson's, but that was the way it was identified. But he said to me, I want to prescribe the drug Aricept for him, and I can only do that if I say that I think he's got Alzheimer's. And he was prescribed the Aricept, and it did work extremely well. And he said at the time, the consultant, he said, well, there are those of us who think that this drug is useful in Parkinson's. But he said that was just anecdotal evidence, which I guess the different consultants, talk to each other and put in those information.
And physicians, consultants can use any treatment for any condition if they think there's reasonable evidence to suggest that it might work. But having wholesale use of that treatment for a new condition does need clinical studies, etc.
Yeah, presumably that's how it starts, is it?
Yes,
somebody tries it and it works, and then you build on that as a possibility. And
you build on that, yes. If it can be built on, then yes, that's how it might start.
Certainly Professor Wise said that what happened with my husband was very useful information for him.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any results due soon? Any projects that are coming to end of a trial?
Which drug are you talking about?
There was one trial going on with the diabetes drug, wasn't there?
That's still ongoing.
Yeah, when are the results expected?
I couldn't tell you, but if I find out, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions from someone? Anything else?
Yes, please.
Go on then.
Hi. I'm used to ondansetron being used intravenous for postoperative sickness. You're saying possibly it could be used for Parkinson's. Would it then be an oral form, do you know? Or would it have to remain intravenous?
No, there's two forms, oral and IV. It's the oral one which is being tested now, yes.
Mm-hmm. Right, I didn't know. I just know the IV one. Yeah, thank you.
If they're paying, if the farmers are paying the academics to do the research, is there any possibility or anything that might suggest that the academics might skew the results, or is that a bit naughty to say that? I know it's a naughty question.
Well, yeah, you're asking about whether there's a conflict of payments from pharma companies. It's the research which is being funded by not necessarily individual researchers. They don't necessarily benefit, and actually it wouldn't necessarily be good for that researcher if he did put his finger on the scales.
No, it would be very bad, I suspect. But
yeah, absolutely, yes.
But I wondered whether there's a possibility that would happen.
Well, I mean,
some with less integrity than others, possibly.
Right.
So, are there any more questions? Because we will let Sunil kind of we'll release Sunil into the community. But I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I think that possibly we might ask you to come back and give us some more details of what's happening, you know, as these drugs come onto the market. It would be really good if maybe you could do some writing for a little bit of writing for us, give us some idea of things that are happening, because well, it's in all our benefits to
absolutely
get drugs.
So, sorry to talk over you. If
that's fine.
In what the charity is providing, let me know, and we'll fit it. If you want something specifically about how this research that we're funding today, how that moves on, I can certainly help you with that as well. Drop me an email, Ruth, and we'll see.
Yeah, we'll do. I think that would be really interesting, because I think then people can read it and absorb it, and then come back with more technical questions, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely.
So shall I thank you now? And so does anybody else want any more questions before we let Sunil go? If not, I will say thank you very, very much indeed.
My pleasure.
About it is it's really clear, because one thing that we need is clarity from science.
Yes. Make life simpler.
They do like charts.
Oh, right, okay.
I'm very fond of charts, which is sometimes a little bit complicated, but that's really good. That's really clear, and I thank you very, very much indeed.
Oh, my pleasure.
And we will have some more information from you.
Yes, indeed. Yes, let me know what you want.
Thank you.
Okay, lovely.
So much. Thank you.